Was Tulipomania, the most famous speculative bubble in history, really not a bubble? Today, many economists argue that the rapid price rises and falls had their rational causes. Regardless of whether it was a bubble, the Tulipomania will forever remain one of the most iconic events in world economic history. Animal instincts mean that humans, since the dawn of time, have often been driven by two emotions: fear and greed. Fear kept people from doing something stupid, while greed pushed mankind to take risks. The history of mankind knows situations when the aforementioned risks were excessive. Sometimes there are situations when a significant number of people simultaneously fall into great fear or go crazy with greed. If the latter phenomenon occurs, price bubbles can occur in the market. A price bubble can involve very strange assets. A great example is the bubble of the first half of the 17th century, when people speculated on tulip bulbs. They had no wider use in the productive activities of mankind at that time. Many invested all their life's possessions for one reason: their price was rising. The craze of the 17th century was hailed as Tulipomania. It seems silly now, but this is where greed and fear come in. At first, people may have scoffed at investing in tulip bulbs. However, when they saw that their neighbors had become considerably richer from this practice, greed and regret for the missed opportunity arose. Apparently, there is nothing worse than seeing your neighbor get rich faster than you. As a result, people who didn't know anything about tulips bought them or contracts for their supply only in the hope of finding someone willing to buy them back at a higher price in the future, the so-called game of the greater fool. Tulipomania was a social phenomenon and found numerous references in art. Paintings and satires referring to the craze were created. Although Tulipomania found its way into public perception as an example of speculative madness that gripped a large part of society, some researchers take a different view. They believe that it was a limited-scale, speculative episode. In today's episode, we will take a closer look at both points of view. Chapter 1. Market Environment. The beginning of the formation of the United Provinces, today's Netherlands, dates back to 1579. That's when 7 provinces signed the Union of Utrecht. This was a declaration of disobedience to Catholic Spain by the Protestant provinces of the Netherlands. The Union of Utrecht was a sort of answer to the Treaty of Arras, where the southern Catholic provinces of the Netherlands declared allegiance to Spain. A few years later, the Republic of the United Provinces was officially established, and for the next several decades, it waged war with Spain for recognition of its independence. This conflict was later dubbed the 80 Years' War. One of the founding fathers of the United Provinces was William I of Orange. The United Provinces were Protestant, and for this reason were a place of refuge for many people of similar faith. The refugees were looking for a region that would allow them to practice their faith. Among those fleeing were skilled workers, which allowed the Netherlands to stimulate economic development. In addition, the work ethic, which originated in Calvinism, also helped. Calvinists placed great emphasis on education and labor. This allowed to increase labor productivity, which resulted in increased competitiveness in the European market. The United Provinces were also becoming a place where capital flowed in from all over Protestant Europe. Amsterdam was becoming one of the financial centers of the old continent. It is worth remembering that the first half of the 17th century was a period known as the Golden Age in the Netherlands. Merchants grew rich from trade with the Far East. It was estimated that one successful trade expedition to Asia could bring profits of up to 400%. The most important company in the world during this period was the Dutch East India Company. It was also the first company to be listed on the stock exchange. The company had a state monopoly on trading with countries in the Far East. Particularly profitable for the company was the spice trade, where the selling price of some products was 17 times higher than the purchase price. Economies of scale allowed the East India Company to compete with English, Portuguese, and Spanish competitors. In addition, the Dutch company had its own fleet and military to provide protection along the sea lanes. This reduced the risk of losses from corsairs and pirates. As a result, in the 17th century, there were investors who profited from the increase in the company's share price and the company's payment of dividends. Profits from trade were reinvested in operations and partially used for consumption. The enrichment of society meant that household needs were increasing. Cities were becoming more beautiful, and the taste of the upper classes more sophisticated. This was also reflected in gardens, which were one of the places to manifest one's status. One of the symbols of wealth at the time were tulips, which were an exotic imported flower. Chapter 2. The Market for Tulips from 1634 to 1637. As soon as the flowers gained popularity, professionals involved in tulip cultivation raised their prices. This was helped by a good economy, which was further sustained by profitable trade with Asia. In 1634, demand for bulbs also began to come from French speculators who wanted to take advantage of price arbitrage to profit from the tulip trade. The steady rise in tulip prices continued until 1636. At that time, the price increase was due to faster growth in demand that supply could not meet. In 1636, tulips were one of the most important export commodities, along with gin and cheese, of the United Provinces. It can be said that even then the Netherlands was becoming the tulip hub of Europe. Not surprisingly, the price of bulbs depended on the supply and demand for the commodity. It should be noted that the supply depended on the storage conditions of the tulip bulbs and on whether there was a blight that could decimate their numbers. Since it took a year to rebuild the supply, to dig up new bulbs from planted tulips, the price of the flowers could fluctuate very strongly with rumors of a potential supply next season. In November of the same year, the price of some tulip bulbs began to rise dramatically. Very quickly, the prices of the most rare specimens began to reach prices exceeding hundreds of guilders. The speculative period was fueled by contracts for the supply of tulips for the new season. The Dutch called these contracts windhandel or air trade. The name came from the fact that none of the bulbs changed hands during the trade. Buyers were able to invest with leverage, as they only had to pay a fee of 2.5% of the contract value. The contracts in question were not traded on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, but on the over-the-counter, OTC, market. It is worth mentioning that it was not a very liquid market. Rarely did any contract change more buyers than 3 times. Thus, it was not the trading we are accustomed to today. The peak of the tulip mania occurred during the winter of 1636-1637, with some contracts changing buyers as many as 5 times. This meant that in such an illiquid market there were eager buyers who believed they could get rich very quickly from buying dearly and selling even more dearly. It was a game of greater fool. 2 things were necessary: an influx of capital into the market, sustaining the belief that prices can only go up. Chapter 3. Tulipomania and Market Data, the problem with studying the phenomenon. Unfortunately, the 17th century was not as developed in terms of reporting market prices as it was after the Industrial Revolution. As a result, there is little data on the price development of tulip bulbs. For this reason, there is no precise data on when the tulip market bubble began and ended. Much of the data on prices comes from an anonymous satire called Dialogues between Weermunt and Gergoet. The satire in question was written just after the price bubble burst. The reliability of this data is being questioned by some historians. One economist, Peter Garber, collected data on the sale of 161 bulbs relating to 39 species of tulips. The data covered the years 1633, 1637, and according to The Economist, 53 of them were recorded in dialogues. Interestingly, of the 161 bulbs, the most data concerned February 5, 1637, when the bubble burst. From that day, The Economist collected data on 98 transactions. In addition, the prices concerned various transactions such as futures trading, spot transactions, notarized sales by growers, and sales of bulbs for real estate. Thus, there was no homogeneous market for tulip bulbs, but rather transactions between individuals in a non-standardized market. Chapter 4. The Madness of Crowds, the Impact on the Views of Future Generations. In 1841, Scottish journalist Charles Mackay published a book titled Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. In it, he included several examples of market madness. Among them were included stories of the South Sea Bubble and the Mississippi Company scam. In addition, one of the examples was the Tulipomania. The book set the tone for many years of research on the tulip bubble. For generations, the book was analyzed by other economists and speculators alike, who learned from this book how to recognize periods of market frenzy and subsequent periods of panic and depression. Interestingly, Mackay's book relied, among other things, on Johann Beckmann's work, A History of Inventions, Discoveries and Origins. In this work, the data regarding tulipomania was based largely on the dialogues mentioned earlier. According to Charles, at the time of tulipomania, even very poor citizens of the Netherlands were speculating in these flowers. The book included information about people giving up 5 hectares, 12 acres, of land for a Semper Augustus tulip bulb. Others offered a basket of goods worth 2,500 florins for a single bulb of the Viceroy variety. This was a staggering amount of money. A skilled worker could earn about 350 florins a year. According to the book, the tulip fever affected every social stratum. The desire to speculate was further enhanced by stories of people who got rich very quickly. The mood was very optimistic, with some believing that people from all over the world at the time would buy tulips exclusively in the Netherlands. However, these were pipe dreams. The momentary price appreciation could not last forever, because it was very easy to grow more bulbs from the tulip you had. So the Dutch monopoly could not last forever. What's more, after all, these flowers came to the Netherlands from the Ottoman Empire. So there were other countries that could have increased production, which would have lowered prices. The book also contains anecdotes that current researchers find unlikely. One of them says that one sailor mistook a tulip onion for a normal onion and ate it for breakfast. At the time of consumption, the value of such a tulip onion could provide breakfast for the entire ship's crew for an entire year. According to the story, the sailor was to be held accountable and stand trial. From the accounts cited in The Madness of Crowds, one can find traces of behavior typical of the period of market mania. Investors bought contracts to buy tulips, only to resell them at a higher price. They were not interested in physically owning the bulbs and planting them in the garden. What encouraged the purchases was the desire to get rich quick. The longer this mania lasted, the more difficult it became to maintain. This was because more and more capital was needed to maintain the upward trend on tulip bulb prices. Chapter 5. A New Look at the Tulip Bubble. One of the better-known opponents of the standard view of this period in history was Anne Goldgar. The American historian believed that tulipomania affected a rather narrow group of people. In turn, most of the stories were part of the reproduction of exaggerated stories concerning speculation. According to Goldgar, the bulb trade was not as fluid as reported by 18th and 19th century researchers. From a study of period documents, her opinion is that the tulip trade mainly concerned merchants and experienced craftsmen. It did not, however, concern the elite of the Netherlands at the time. What's more, of the participants in the transaction Anne researched, she managed to find only 6 rich people who experienced financial difficulties in 1637, the year the bubble burst. Currently, some economists and economic historians are focusing on finding rational reasons for the price increase. The impact of the 30-Year War is considered to be one of the reasons for the sharp change in the price. The reason may have been the influx of optimism caused by the accession of the Netherlands and France to the Protestant Party and the beginning of the occupation of the Spanish Netherlands. With the start of the plague and the outflow of capital to finance the war, the market collapsed. The aforementioned reason poorly explains such a strong increase in bulb prices. The plague and wars may be one of the reasons for the significant drop in tulip prices. Goldgar mentions that a similar change in flower prices also took a similar course later on. As an example, she cited hyacinths, which became extremely popular in the 19th century. As a result, florists began buying bulbs of this flower rapidly to meet demand. At first, it ended with a significant increase in the price of bulbs. When the market became saturated, there began to be a shortage of those willing to drive the price up further. The increase in supply led to a huge deflation in the price of these flowers. In 30 years, the prices of the most expensive bulbs fell by 99% from their price peak. Peter Garber, on the other hand, mentions that Tulipomania, despite its limited translation into the economy and financial market, took a big toll on the consciousness of people living during and just after the bubble. For many religious conservative thinkers, it was something ridiculous that the price of a bulb of a flower that blooms very quickly could be worth more than the labor of an honest person for a whole year. For this reason, stories passed down from generation to generation warned against the folly of speculation. Therefore, stories about the consequences of mania were exaggerated in numerous satires. Chapter 6. A critical look at Anne Goldgar's work. Some researchers, however, believe that Goldgar's research cannot fully explain such a large rise and fall in prices. In particular, the theory corresponds poorly with some of the high price increases of ordinary tulip bulbs. There are economists who believe that the bubble in the tulip market was a mere echo of the significant increase in the money supply seen in the Netherlands. Earl Thompson also believed that Anne's arguments could not explain why some tulip bulbs fell as much as 99.99999% in just a few months, when at that time flower prices generally fell up to 40% in a bull market. According to Thompson, one of the reasons for the sharp change in prices was government intervention, which resulted from lobbying by flower traders. As a result of the traders' urging, the law on tulip bulb contracts was changed. Until now, contracts required the buyer to compulsorily redeem it at a certain price. After the law was changed, the contract was only an option to buy. So formally, forward contracts, obligation to buy, were turned into options, right to buy. Failure to buy was to result in the payment of a commission of several percent of the contract's value. Earl believed that some investors in the market knew about the change in the law, so they hoped they could use leverage to buy tulips. They counted on a future increase in the price of the bulbs, knowing that all they had to lose was the premium paid and a contract penalty worth a few percent of the contract. On February 24, 1637, the Dutch Guild of Flower Traders announced that all contracts entered into after November 30th and before the opening of the exchange in the spring of 1637 would be interpreted as contracts without obligation to buy, if the buyer of the contract paid a small penalty to the seller of the contract, the owner of the bulbs. Thus, the increase in futures prices was rational behavior on the part of speculators who knew that they would not have to purchase onions in the future. Tulipomania. Summary. Tulipomania is one of the most famous examples of speculative fever in history. Interestingly, the game of greater fool still applies, despite the fact that almost 400 years have passed since the tulip bubble. Examples include the dot-com bubble or the decline in the valuation of growth companies in 2022. In the 17th century, some merchants and speculators believed that tulip prices would continue to rise despite the fact that tulips, such as Viceroy and Semper Augustus, were valued at many years of skilled labor. At the peak of the bubble, the most valuable tulips were sold at 10,000 guilders, the equivalent of a mansion on Amsterdam's Grand Canal. Such prices could not be sustained indefinitely. Tulips are an ordinary commodity, and they are also easy to produce in the long term. So it couldn't be worth that much in the long term. Some researchers suggest that the actual extent of the Tulipomania was much smaller than in period descriptions. The fever was said to affect only merchants and a small circle of speculators. According to these researchers, the 17th century secondary market was not as liquid as it is today, so contracts were very rarely traded. In their view, the stories were exaggerated as part of the education of future generations about human greed and stupidity. Even if the Tulipomania had a limited financial reach, it certainly took its toll on the culture of the time. This can be seen in the numerous paintings and satires of the era. Another lesson that comes from this story is to put emotions aside when investing or speculating. When playing the greater fool, you never know who really is. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. I hope you learned many interesting things about economics, finance, and investor behavior through it. Consider subscribing to our channel to hear more such fanciful stories.